Welcome to part 2 of the Synoptic Gospels on Trial. In the last part, we looked at the Synoptic Gospels and noted that they shared a lot of material in common. That's Matthew, Mark and Luke. And then we looked at the evidence that's used to establish why biblical scholars think that there's a literary relationship between these three Gospels. And we looked at triple tradition. That's material that is shared by all three Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. We also looked at double tradition. That's material shared by just Matthew and Luke, but not Mark. But we also looked at the ordering of the Gospels. And we noted that they shared the ordering of their material. And because of this, we begin to suspect that there's not just a literary relationship, but perhaps a literary dependency. In other words, somebody copied somebody else. And this leads us to the synoptic problem, which is a bit like putting the Gospels on trial, trying to establish who is the guilty party, or parties. Who are the ones guilty of copying or plagiarizing? And the easiest way to do that is to try and establish who wrote their Gospel first. Because once we've done that, we can eliminate them as being guilty of plagiarizing. Well, certainly of the Gospels that we have. And so now we come to the trial proper, establishing who wrote their Gospel first.
The court finds that there is a case to answer. However, the prosecution has yet to establish who is guilty of plagiarism. Would the prosecution concede that the author to write first would not be guilty of plagiarism, and therefore suspicion would consequently be thrown on the other two?
Yes, Your Honour.
In which case, we will now hear from the defence counsel for Luke.
My client Luke not only acknowledges that he has used traditions about Jesus readily in circulation, but at the beginning of his Gospel has specifically drawn attention to the facts. I refer here to his statement found at the beginning of his Gospel, in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Therefore, he can't be guilty of plagiarism.
Objection, Your Honour. Luke's admission of using traditions is insufficient to clear him of this charge. He does not state the tradition's origin, and does not account for the verbatim copying. Furthermore, he shows blatant disregard for Harvard referencing. There's no page number, no year, and no bibliography in sight.
Due to the verbatim nature that is found in the Synoptic Gospels, the objection is sustained, and we will now hear from the defence counsel for Matthew.
My client denies all counts of plagiarism, which is further substantiated by the work of the renowned biblical scholar Johann Jacob Griesbach. He notes that there has been a long-standing tradition dating back to the early church fathers, who include Clement of Alexandria and Irenaeus, both recognising Matthew as the first to write. If your honour permits, may I refer to some primary witnesses from this tradition?
You may, but please be brief.
Irenaeus, writing at around 185 CE, in his Against Heresies, clearly orders the Synoptic Gospels as Matthew, Mark and Luke. Please refer to witness statement A from Irenaeus. Clement of Alexandria, writing around a similar time, has been recorded as stating that those Gospels were first written which include the genealogies. The only Gospels that include genealogies are Matthew and Luke. Although this does not mean that we can definitively say that Clement believed Matthew to be prior to the other Gospels, we can be very confident that he viewed Mark as subsequent to Matthew. I now refer to witness statement B. At the beginning of the 3rd century, Origen was reported to have stated that the order of writing was Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. In fact, the Augustinian hypothesis states that Matthew was the first of the Gospels to be written, has been part of church tradition for centuries. In the 5th century, he clearly stated that the Gospels are believed to have been written in the order which follows: first Matthew, then Mark, thirdly Luke, lastly John.
Objection, Your Honour. Griesbach and Augustine are known to be in dispute about the order of the Gospels.
Counsel for Matthew, is this the case?
It is indeed true that Griesbach and Augustine do not entirely agree about the order of the composition of the synoptics. Augustine contends that Mark copied Matthew in an abbreviated form, and then Luke copied Matthew and Mark's abridged version of Matthew. However, Griesbach argues that Luke copied Matthew first, and then Mark summarised both Matthew and Luke's Gospels. The main point still stands. They both agree that Matthew wrote his Gospel first. In furtherance to my defence, may I refer you to the scholarly work of Edward Masso, who, after painstaking research of early church literature, observes that the Gospel of Mark was almost entirely ignored by the early church. He argues that of the Synoptic Gospels, the early church fathers principally used the Gospel of Matthew. He writes that references to Mark in early church writings are almost non-existent. Why would this be the case if Mark was the first of the canonical Gospels? For a more detailed quote, please see Witness Statement C. The answer to those questions, Your Honour, is that the evidence all points to the fact that the early church believed the first Gospel to be written was Matthew, and that the Gospel of Mark, to use Augustine's words, was an attendant and abbreviator to Matthew, nothing more than a poorly written summary for which, as the evidence shows, the church had little use of.
The court will now give an opportunity for the defence counsel for Mark to respond to this accusation.
Your Honour, this injurious accusation that my client is a poor abbreviator of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and is nothing more than a mere summary of them, is simply outrageous. My client, as the writer of the first Gospel, intended to write an energetic account of the main actions of Jesus, beginning at the start of his ministry and up until his death on the cross. If that were to be the case, why would my client choose to omit some of the most important material that is found in both Matthew and Luke? For example, the accounts of Jesus' birth, most of his teaching, including the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer, and even details of the resurrection. If, as the accusation suggests, Mark is an abbreviated summary of Matthew and perhaps Luke, would we not expect, therefore, that Mark's version of the accounts that are found in Matthew to be shorter?
Yes, it would be natural to assume that.
In that case, how do we explain why the accounts of Jesus performing miracles in Matthew's Gospel are consistently much shorter than those found in Mark? In fact, a strong case can be made that Matthew constantly is found to abbreviate Mark's accounts.
Would the counsel for the defence of Matthew like to respond?
It is true that my client shows a far greater preference in recording the teaching of Jesus than his miracles. I would maintain that the reason Mark supplements these miracle accounts with more details is simply that, for his own editorial reasons, he wishes to place a greater emphasis upon them. I would also like to draw your attention to another way that Mark has added to my client's Gospel. For example, in Matthew 15, there is an account where Jesus' disciples are criticised by the Pharisees and the scribes for not adhering to the tradition of ritual hand-washing before they eat. However, in Mark's version, he inserts Mark 7, verses 3 to 4, with a lengthy and not altogether accurate explanation of the Jewish custom of the day. Nevertheless, this too is quite consistent with my assertion that Mark was summarising my client's Gospel. The Gospel of Matthew is well known for its distinctively Jewish character. In fact, it has often been called the most Jewish of the Gospels. The Gospel of Mark, on the other hand, has a greater Greco-Roman influence. He uses a number of Latinisms, Greek versions of Latin words. For example, legion, centurion and tribute money. This strongly suggests that Mark was writing for a non-Jewish audience. It is therefore not surprising that Mark feels the need to repeatedly provide explanations for the more Jewish aspect of my client's writing.
I object, Your Honour.
Upon what grounds?
A case can also be made stating the exact opposite. As defence for Matthew has already acknowledged, Mark's Gospel has a distinctively Roman character. If Matthew wanted to rework Mark's Gospel for a more conservative Jewish audience, it would make perfect sense for him to omit these types of explicatory material. It would be simply superfluous. Your Honour, I draw your attention to the work of Michael Goulder and more recently that of Philip Segal, who argue that Matthew is an adaptation and expansion of Mark by a common method of Jewish interpretation called midrash or halakha.
There does seem to be a certain ambiguity about how one interprets this evidence. Counsel for the defence of Mark, do you have any other evidence to bring?
Your Honour, can I refer you to the phenomenon called Mark as middle term? This is where comparisons between the three Gospels show that Mark is in closer agreement to Matthew and Luke than Matthew and Luke are to each other. For example, in many places, Luke copies Mark, where Matthew does not. But in other places, Matthew copies Mark, but Luke does not. The most plausible explanation for this is that Mark wrote first.
Does your case rest there?
No, Your Honour. The nature of those departures or changes is also highly significant.
Proceed.
Your Honour, like most innovations, I do concede that unfortunately the Gospel of Mark does contain a number of errors. For example, in Mark 1 verse 2, my client quotes two prophecies from the Old Testament, one from Malachi and one from Isaiah. However, he wrongly attributes both to Isaiah. However, this is corrected in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 3 verse 3. Furthermore, in Mark 2 verse 26, there is an account where Jesus is referring to the incident where David ate bread offered to God in the temple. It erroneously claims that Abiathar and not Ahimelech was high priest at the time. Matthew manages to retain much of Mark's account and at the same time avoid this error simply by omitting this detail. Your Honour, which would be more likely? For Matthew to copy Mark and whilst doing so correct some of his errors? Or, as the counsel for Matthew's defence is trying to suggest, that Mark copies Matthew in an abbreviated form and then chooses to add material that is erroneous. There is one further point I would like to lay before the court. It has often been noted that not only is the grammatical style of Matthew and Luke better, but their presentation of the disciples is more positive and Jesus is treated with much greater respect. For example, in Mark 4, verses 35 to 41, we read his account of Jesus stilling the storm. In it, the disciples are depicted as waking the sleeping Jesus with a curt, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" However, in Matthew 8, verse 25, they are far more respectful, using the title Lord and appealing to him to savour. Later on in Mark 6, verses 47 to 52, the disciples see Jesus walking on the water. However, although amazed, they do not understand, for their hearts were hardened. However, Matthew not only includes an account of Peter walking with Jesus on the water, but in Matthew 14, verse 33, the disciples are depicting as worshipping Jesus and claiming that he truly is the Son of God. Both Matthew and Luke consistently present Jesus in their Gospels as being far more revered by those around him. I would ask again, is it more likely that Matthew takes Mark's account, using more respectful language for Jesus and depicting him in a more reverential way, or that Mark takes Matthew's account and uses less respectful or reverential language to describe Jesus?
Let us then proceed with your defence of Mark.
I would first like to refer to the work of Burnett Hillman Streeter, who suggests that Mark not only wrote first, but both Matthew and Luke are guilty in independently copying from Mark. He also suggests that Matthew also took material from a source called M, and Luke from a source called L.
Counsellor, on a point of clarification for the court, whilst you have given an account for why material in Mark is also found in Luke and Matthew, if I draw your attention to Exhibit D, if you maintain Matthew and Luke are working independently, how does one account for the close agreement of double tradition material? Does this not also suggest some kind of literary relationship between Matthew and Luke?
Your Honour, Streeter argues that alongside Mark, these two authors also independently copied another document referred to as Q.
Objection, Your Honour. This source Q is purely hypothetical. We have absolutely no evidence for its existence.
Counsellor, how do you respond to this objection?
Your Honour, it is true that we do not have an extant or surviving copy of Q. However, those who support the Q hypothesis point to two things. Firstly, year by year, more and more ancient manuscripts are being discovered. Many works once supposed forever lost have now been found. Secondly, initially one of the great problems with the Q hypothesis was that it is totally unlike the other Gospels. It contains very little narrative, no nativity, no accounts of miracles, no death or resurrection of Jesus. It comprises only sayings or teachings of Jesus. However, in 1945 the Gospel of Thomas was discovered. Although it is not Q, its format is very close to that of Q.
Objection, Your Honour. There are still problems with the theory of Q found in Streeter's hypothetical document, as it does not account for minor agreements that appear when Matthew and Luke agree against Mark. please refer to Exhibit E. Not only will you find that Matthew and Luke had added to Mark's text the wording they share, but the Greek word struck is extremely rare and not found in any other place in either Gospel. The likelihood of these authors independently using this word is extremely small.
Counsel for Mark, how do you respond?
Your Honour, may I refer the court to the work of Austin Farrer? Farrer therefore proposes that Mark wrote first. This was then copied by Matthew, who added more material, and this in turn was then copied by Luke. And therefore, Q is an unnecessary complication. The defence rests.
Members of the jury, you have heard that there is a strong case for plagiarism occurring within the Synoptic Gospels. Your task is to decide which of the expert witnesses that you have heard statements from provide the best defence and most compelling argument.
OK, so now it's your turn. As a member of the jury, you have listened to all the evidence, and now it's time for you to decide who makes the best case for their defence. In other words, which of the Gospel writers did you think writes their Gospel first, and therefore ought not be charged with plagiarism? Let's sum up the evidence that we have heard. Luke. Luke freely admits in the introduction to his Gospel that he has used other people's material, although he doesn't say who they are. Matthew claims he is innocent, that he wrote his Gospel first by pointing to the tradition of the early church leaders, who clearly taught that Matthew wrote his Gospel first. We also saw that the Gospel of Mark was rarely used in the early church. We saw that the Griesbach hypothesis and also the Augustinian hypothesis, although that's not quite so popular nowadays, rests on Matthean priority, or that Matthew wrote his Gospel first. However, if we assume that Mark does copy Matthew, we need to answer some important questions. These are: why does Mark use a less reverent language about Jesus? There's also the question of errors that are found in Mark, but not in Matthew. And also there's a question of Mark's omissions of key, important texts, such as the Sermon of the Mount, the Lord's Prayer, and some of the resurrection accounts. Finally, we listen to Mark's defence. Mark's defence rests on the explanation for some of these textual differences found between Mark and Matthew. If Mark wrote first and then Matthew copies him, then it explains why Matthew uses more respectful language, and that Matthew corrects Mark's error and Mark's grammar. It also explains why Matthew adds more material to Mark and also abbreviates some of his miracle accounts in order to accommodate more of Jesus' teaching, which seems to be central to Matthew's Gospel. We also saw Mark as middle term, which suggests that Mark was either written last or Mark's counsel would argue, Mark was written first. And we saw that some of the more popular solutions to the synoptic problem rest on Markan priority, or that Mark wrote his Gospel first. The hypotheses with Q and without Q. So now I will leave you to make up your decision. Who is innocent? Matthew, Mark, or Luke? Thank you for listening.